Ever since the end of the Second World War, the role of Europe in world affairs has been diminished by its defeat in that war and by the tremendous ideological pressures it has had to suffer at the hands of American liberalism and its radical counterpart, Russian communism. Nevertheless, there have been a few attempts at the revival of a Eurocentric worldview, such as that propounded by the American Francis Parker Yockey, and those of the Europeans Alexandre Kojève and Jean-François Thiriart. Since Yockey is of these three already quite well known, I shall discuss here the other two European projects of European imperium. Alexander Koscievnikov, or in French Alexandre Kojève, was a Russian Hegelian philosopher and statesman and nephew of the Russian abstract artist Wassily Kandinsky. Kojève studied at the universities of Berlin and Heidelberg, where he obtained his doctorate in 1926. He then moved to France, where at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, he gave a distinguished series of talks between 1933 and 1939 on Hegel's Phenomenologie des Geistes. He later worked in the French Ministry of Economic Affairs and helped guide the government towards the constitution of a European Common Market, which was established by the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Apart from the several valuable publications on philosophy that constitute Kojève's intellectual oeuvre, his article, called Esquisse d'une doctrine de la politique française, written around the 27th of August 1945, that is just before the end of the Second World War, is certainly one of the most interesting contributions to European geopolitical discourse. The esquisse was composed primarily as a guide to making France economically and politically a nation of the first rank that could counter any future revival of Germany as a continental power, especially in alliance with other Protestant nations such as Britain or the USA. Kojève firmly believed that after the war, the nation-states of the past would have to be replaced by imperial systems. He points to the efforts of the Third Reich to create an imperial structure in Europe and notices that the disastrous failure of the Germans was due to the lack of any integrationist intentions on the part of its leaders. Hitler's German Reich was too nationalist to succeed as an international enterprise on the continent. As Kojève puts it can therefore be said that Germany lost this war because she wanted to win it as a nation-state. The socialists, on the other hand, had unrealistically jumped from the notion of a nation to that of humanity in general, which being a mere abstraction could only lead to utopian political schemes. The liberals, too, are now in the process of attempting a continental structure, but their focus in society rather than state will inevitably fail, since their concept of society is one focused on individuals that see no value in collective units. The necessary intermediate stage between a nation and universality, according to Kojève, is that of an empire. Kojève points to Stalin as one who had understood this principle in the USSR, whereas Trotsky had foolishly pursued universalist goals instead. The Anglo-American Empire, constituted as a politico-economic bloc, has a more solid basis as a vast union of affiliated nations. And the danger at the moment of writing the article is that Germany may, as a Protestant nation, gradually ally itself with this transatlantic unit and thereby boost its political strength in addition to its present economic power. In order to counter the ambitions of the Soviet and the Anglo-American empires, Kojève insists that France must form and head a Latin empire of its own that combined the economic and social forces of France, Spain, and Italy. His starting point for the development of a Latin empire is the shared Latin quality of the character and the mentality of its populations. His description of this quality is memorable and worth quoting at least in part, and I quote now. It seems that this mentality is specifically characterized by that art of leisure, which is a source of art in general, by the aptitude for creating the sweetness of living, which has nothing to do with material comfort. This shared mentality, which entails a profound sense of beauty generally, associated with a very distinct sense of proportion, and which thus permits the transformation of simple bourgeois well-being into aristocratic sweetness of living. This mentality not only assures the Latin people of their real, that is to say, political and economic union, it also in a way justifies this union in the eyes of the world and of history. Thus of the three empires, Anglo-American, Russian and Latin, it is the Latin that is culturally the most highly developed. For, as Kojève says, the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans and the Slavs do not possess, and will never possess, what the Latins, with the French at their head, have given and will continue to give to the civilized world. The combination of natural and demographic resources within the Latin Empire would allow it to be independent of other rival empires. For the defense of its autarky, the Latin Empire would necessarily require a strong army that can defend its domains. The latter can most easily be defended if they are contiguous spaces rather than far-flung. Thus, the Mediterranean would be a vital zone of the Latin Empire that extends to the shores of North Africa. However, more distant countries like the Latin American too will perhaps eventually join the European Latin Empire, since they participate in the same civilization that the latter represents and defends. Kojève is also not averse to the colonial efforts on the part of any European empire, and he even encourages the three major nations of Latin Europe to consolidate their colonial possessions, including the Arabic. In fact, he believes that the Latin Empire could spearhead a fruitful collaboration between Latinity and Islam. And I quote him, all in all, it is the economic unity of the continuous block of the African possessions which must be the real basis and the unifying principle of the Latin Empire. It is even possible that it is in this unified Latino-African world that the Muslim problem can one day be resolved. For, since the Crusades, Arab Islam and Latin Catholicism united in their mutual opposition concerning several synthetic points of view. For example, the influence of Arabic thought and scholasticism, the penetration of Islamic art into the Latin countries, etc. And there is no reason to believe that within a true empire, the synthesis of opposites could not be freed of its internal contradictions, which are really irreducible only with respect to purely national interests. For the successful maintenance of communications with the African colonies, it is vital that the Mediterranean be considered as the Latin Empire's mare nostrum, or private sea. As he puts it, while abandoning the oceans to the rivalries of the two other empires, the Latin Empire must reserve exclusive rights to the Mediterranean. This control of the sea is necessary, since the Latin Empire is, and I quote, responsible for the conservation of a civilization which we largely created, and it can thus be said that the final goal of Latin imperial policy is maintaining peace in the European West. Economically, however, Kojève supports the alliance of the Latin Empire with the most successful Western powers, such as the American, while Soviet support would naturally be forthcoming to a bloc that acts as a buffer against American hegemonic ambitions. Within the Latin Empire, there will be one that must take the lead, and that country can only be France, which has an economic advantage over Italy and Spain. The Latin Empire must avoid both the liberalism of great unregulated cartels and massive unemployment due to the Anglo-Saxon bloc, and the leveling and sometimes barbaric statism of the Soviet Union. The Latin imperial enterprise will require an elite composed of the most efficient members of all political sections of the population and represent the Gaullists who constitute the political will of France, the economic and technological leaders, as well as the communists who champion the working classes. As Kojève puts it, and I quote, "To be able to create a useful political work, a link must thus be created in France between the masses, more or less controlled by the Communist Party, the political will represented by General de Gaulle, and the real powers held by the economic, technical, and cultural elite. Even though the anti-statist leftist intellectuals must be shunned, along with the excessively reactionary elements of the Vichyist nationalists, he says the proposed political idea must also be capable of rallying the old, more or less national enthusiasts, as well as all fans of well-executed and constructive labor. The Catholic Church, which already permeates the cultures of the European countries within the Latin Empire, must recover its leadership within the empire as the religious aspect of its imperial government. Just as the Anglo-American Empire is basically Protestant in its social foundations, and the Soviet is Russian Orthodox, so too the Latin Empire will be Roman Catholic. France's efforts must be directed to the consolidation of the Roman Catholic Church and to freeing the Vatican from American influences, so that the Roman Catholic Church may finally achieve its goal of uniting the three churches and of ushering a unified Catholic humanity. As Kojève reminds us, if humanity, which is really integrated, that is, politically, socially, and economically unified, still preserves an ecclesiastical structure, it could only be provided by a church which is universal, that is, Catholic, in the strict and fullest sense of the term. And he goes on to add that this transformation into a universal and single church is not only the goal of Catholicism, but also the key to the destiny of Europe. Whether the indefinite future belongs to the humanist irreligion predicted and praised by some, or to this Christian Catholicism, which is the final end and the only raison d'etre of Catholic Christianity, which engendered, among other things, the Latin spiritual world. When we turn to the imperial project of Jean-François Thiriart, we find many of the elements of Kojève's repeated therein, though fully purged of their ethnic and religious qualities. In addition, unlike Kojève's willingness to cooperate economically with other powers like the American or the Soviet, Thiriart's doctrine is marked by a staunch opposition to both these powers. Rather like the American political thinker Francis Parker Yockey before him, Thiriart was one of the first to pivot his entire political project on the precondition of a liberation of Europe from the control of America, which he considered the principal enemy of Europe. Thiriart was born in Brussels and participated in socialist movements in Belgium, such as the Jeune Garde Socialiste and the Union Socialiste Antifasciste. During the Second World War, Thiriart joined the Fichte-Bund, which was part of the Hamburg National Bolshevik movement of the 1920s, and then the Armée du Grand Reich Allemand, an association composed of elements of the extreme left in Wallonia who were favorable to European collaboration with the Reich. Thiriart's association with this group led to imprisonment in 1944 and a deprivation of civic rights in Belgium until 1959. Thiriart re-emerged in 1960 during the decolonization of the Congo by participating in the foundation of the Comité d'Action et de Défense des Belges d'Afrique, which became later the Mouvement d'Action Civique, or MAC. In March 1962, a meeting was organized in Venice, whose participants included, besides Thiriart, who represented the MAC and Belgium, the Italian Socialist Movement from Italy, the Socialist Reich Party from Germany, and the Union Movement of Ostwald Mosley from Great Britain. In a common declaration, these organizations proclaimed that they wanted to found a national European party centered on the idea of European unity, which does not accept satellization of Western Europe by the USA and does not reject reunification with the territories of the East, from Poland to Bulgaria through Hungary. However, the narrow nationalism of the Italians and Germans rapidly broke up this project of a European national party. The failure of this attempt at a party organization coincided also with the defeat of the Organisation Armée Secrète, which fought for French Algeria during the Algerian War and with which Thiriart had sympathized with. Thiriart concluded that the only solution was the creation of a revolutionary European party in a common front with parties or countries opposed to the order of Yalta. The MRC was thus transformed in January 1963 into Jeune Europe, a European organization that had members in Austria, Germany, Spain, France, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Switzerland. Apart from numerous articles related to his Europeanist ideas, Thiriart had already in 1961 written what he called a Manifeste à la Nation Européenne, in which he proclaimed his concept of a communitarian Europe united against the American and Soviet blocs. This manifesto was followed by a book called An Empire de 400 millions d'hommes, published in 1964, and a booklet entitled La Grande Nation, l'Europe unitaire de Brest à Bucharest, published in 1965. Jeune Europe also aimed at forming European revolutionary brigades to start the armed struggle against the American occupier, and searched for external support in Europe, as well as among Third World revolutionaries. Thus contacts were made with Yugoslavia and Romania, Communist China and Iraq, Egypt, and the Palestinian resistance. However, his attempts in 1968 to forge alliances with the Algerians, where, and I quote, European revolutionary patriots would support the formation of special fighters for the future struggle against Israel, technical training of the future action aimed at a struggle against the Americans in Europe, building of an anti-American and anti-Zionist information service for a simultaneous utilization in the Arabian countries and in Europe, proved to be unsuccessful. Similarly, in autumn 1968, Thiriart traveled to the Middle East at the invitation of the governments of Iraq and Egypt and the Ba'ath Party. He met Nasser during this visit, but under Soviet pressure, the Iraqi government refused to support the idea of a cooperation between Arab nationalists, including the nascent Palestinian ones, and Thiriart's European Revolutionary Brigades. The lack of the desired financial and material aid to Jeune Europe and its failure to find a firm base for its pan-European operations was a severe blow to Thiriart's revolutionary ambitions. Further, the fact that after the crises of decolonization, Europe benefited from a decade of economic prosperity reduced the prospects of any revolutionary movement. In 1969, disappointed by the relative failure of his movement and the weakness of his external support, Thiriart renounced militant combat. His thoughts now moved to collaboration with the Soviet Union itself. In the early 80s, Thiriart worked on a book that was never finished, called The Euro-Soviet Empire from Vladivostok to Dublin. As the title of this book shows, Thiriart's view of the Soviet Union had changed. Discarding the old motto, neither Washington nor Moscow, Thiriart assumed a new slogan, with Moscow against Washington. Thiriart had already expressed his satisfaction with the Soviet military intervention in Prague, denouncing the Zionist plots in the so-called Prague Spring in an article entitled Prague, l'URSS et l'Europe, where he hoped that, and I quote, Western Europe allied or Western Europe aggregated to the USSR would be the end of the American imperialism. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, he supported the creation of a new party, the European National Liberation Front, which was a successor of Jeune Europe. It was with a delegation of this front that he went to Moscow in 1992 to meet some of the members of the Russian opposition to Boris Yeltsin. Shortly after his return to Belgium, however, Thiriart died of a heart attack. Thiriart left unfinished many theoretical works in which he analyzed the necessary evolution of the anti-American combat in the light of the disappearance of the USSR. Of these, we may consider three pertaining to Thiriart's geopolitical views in the last years of his life, written between 1987 and 1992. And they're called, in my translation, Europe, the political nation-state, Europe up to Vladivostok, and Turkey, the Mediterranean, and Europe. Thiriart's pan-European project, socialist in inspiration like Kojève's, shares many of the ideas proposed by Kojève in relation to the formation of the Latin Empire. Only Thiriart resolutely discards all ethnic and religious considerations in his own European empire. Like the Roman Republic, Thiriart's European Republic will be formed by men who are fully conscious of a common historic destiny. Empires must necessarily be large and centralized political units that do not tolerate any petty nationalisms within them, for the latter are subject to eventual vassalization by larger powers, such as the USA. The geopolitical conditions of an empire, according to Thiriart, are its continuous space, its natural resources, and its considerable demography. In general, Kleinstaaterei is dangerous, since it is the very strategy whereby larger powers keep potentially hostile nations subjugated. This was the case at the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe, when France saw to it that Germany would remain for long divided and not be allowed to unite into a single nation. The weakness of small-sized national units is also detected in the case of the city-states of ancient Greece that fought among themselves while the Persian emperor looked on at their internal discords with satisfaction. Only the Romans succeeded in establishing a true empire, and the Roman Empire is the model that Thiriart adopts for his own European imperial enterprise. The European Empire can only exist if it extends from Iceland in the west to Siberia in the east, and include the French colonial countries of North Africa, as well as the Turkic republics of the Soviet Union. The principal geographical aim of the European Empire is to gain access to warm seas in the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean. Thus, and I quote, Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, and Balochistan are part of the zone of viability of the European Empire. Thiriart's inclusion of these countries in the European Empire is clearly due to the fact that they have already been partially Europeanized by the colonial French and Russians. He maintains, besides, that these Arab and Asiatic countries are too weak to resist the eventual hegemony of either the USA or China over these regions. The borders of the European Empire, too, must be easy to defend, so it is essential that this empire not only have access to the Arctic glacial ocean, the Atlantic, Sahara, access to the Black Sea, to the Indian Ocean, and to the Pacific Ocean, but it must also have, between China and us, the Himalayas, the Great Altai Mountains, the Gobi Desert. The capital of this spectacular empire will be Istanbul, which, as the historian Henri Clos described it, is, and I quote, the link between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, the north and the south, the Slavic lands, and the Muslim Orient. Thiriart is opposed to any form of federalism, since a federal state will inevitably disintegrate into splinter groups. The fall of the USSR was, according to Thiriart, partly due to its failure to establish Soviet empire when it chose to create a federation of Soviet republics instead. Many of these republics quickly seceded when the USSR finally collapsed. Thiriart favors instead the Jacobin concept of a one and indivisible republic that would not grant autonomy to any part within it. The essential political unity of an imperium can only be achieved in a totalitarian manner. On the other hand, the personal dominion of the communities within an imperium would guarantee to its citizens a free and individualistic development. Thiriart fully rejects the notion of a Latin empire or a Germanic empire, and will not for a moment consider any nation within his European empire as being predominant, as France, for example, must be in Kojève's Latin empire. As Thiriart is opposed to all petty nationalisms and federal unions of European states, he also steadfastly rejects any form of racial discrimination within the empire. Such a vast empire as he envisages will not be able to tolerate the slightest anti-Arab or anti-Turkic discrimination on the part of the Europeans, and ethnic integration will be promoted as vigorously as possible within the empire. Indeed, Thiriart excoriates racial discrimination as being injurious to the security of the European empire. He illustrates his argument with the example of the lack of integration of the Algerians by the French during the time of the French colonial empire, with the result that the Algerians were left in their native state of Islamic backwardness and not given any political rights that might have allowed them to participate in the French empire as legitimate members of it. A colonial possession ruled under such discriminatory conditions could not have been held for long. Similarly, he considers both philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism as equally dangerous, since they tend to regard the Jews as a distinct race within the general population. He prefers to follow the French revolutionary Stanislas de Clermont-Tonnerre's policy, and I quote Clermont-Tonnerre: "One should refuse everything to the Jews as a nation and accord everything to them as individuals. One should de-recognize their judges. One should recognize only our own. They should no longer constitute in the state either a political body or an order. They should be citizens individually. If they do not wish to be that, let them say so, and they may then be banished." Thiriart believes that the Jews should be identified mainly as a religious group rather than as a race, so that the elimination of their religious privileges will allow them to adapt as secular citizens to the European empire. Further, Thiriart maintains that religious and racial differences are generally to be avoided, also because they only help to foster the divisions in society that the privileged classes seek to enforce in order to consolidate their own financial advantages. On this subject, he points to the healthy example of the Ottoman Empire, which discouraged class divisions within it by forbidding the acquisition of property or landed privileges without the permission of the government. While the American empire is basically one of exploitation, the European empire will be one of integration. Petty nationalist activists within Europe must direct their aggressions to the real enemy, which the USA and NATO represent. Thiriart suggests that in the East, a violent political battle on the subject of NATO out of Europe should be begun. The crisis of Russia after the fall of communism is that it has invited the involvement of international finance interests in the Russian Federation and abjectly admires the power of the USA when it should have sought to obtain economic support from the European Union instead. Since industrialization is a requirement of political supremacy, the industrialization of the Russian part of the empire must be supported by Western Europe, which will also rapidly undertake public works projects that effectively link Western Europe with Russia. In order to supervise the economic development of the empire, a scientific and technological elite drawn from all over the empire must be constituted. Thiriart does not consider the role of the oligarchs in Yeltsin's Russia, many of whom may harbor a desire to join forces with their American financial counterparts. Still, when considering the notion of Russia standing by itself, Thiriart is certain that this is unfeasible, since the USA is too cunning a rival to allow this to happen. The only way to circumvent the USA's geopolitical ambitions, according to Thiriart, is for Europe to join Russia in ousting NATO from the continent. To this end, the present European Union should be firmly consolidated and a single currency adopted throughout it. Thiriart does not seem to have foreseen the rising power of Zionism that we witness in our own times. Thus his plans regarding Israel, expressed in a 1987 interview with the American evangelical writer Gene Holberg, seem today rather unrealistic. As he stated then, Israel must become a protectorate of either Russia or Europe until these two are united. And he says a united Europe should only tolerate a small pastoral Israel with the borders prescribed by the UN, an Israel of kibbutzes and grapefruit, while the biblical paranoia of the Israeli extreme right, who dream of a greater Israel stretching to the Euphrates, must be denounced and resisted with vigor. Thiriart does not consider carefully the intimate political relationship between Israel and the USA, and the anomaly of tolerating such a pro-American entity as Israel within the European empire. Just as in the case of his fanciful suggestion of granting Jews citizenship in the empire on the condition of their renouncing all Jewish political affiliations, Thiriart does not seem to have arrived at a satisfactory solution to the problem of the state of Israel itself within the scheme of his European empire. We have also seen that Thiriart, employing his own version of scientific socialism, will not tolerate any form of religion to direct the affairs of the imperium. By ignoring the differences between three Christian churches in Europe, however, Thiriart runs roughshod over the deeply ingrained cultural differences between the adherents of these churches. Kojève's notion that the empire must be spiritually founded is, from a philosophical and historical perspective, clearly superior to Thiriart's atheistic venture, just as Kojève's identification of the aristocratic artistic qualities of the peoples inhabiting the Latin Empire is sadly lacking in Thiriart's focus on a mostly technocratic elite to run his European empire. Nevertheless, in spite of these defects of his system, his impetuous reduction of secularism to atheism, and his underestimation of the racial political character of the Jews, Thiriart's vision of a united Europe that will be equal to the USA or China as a great power, and their superior as a civilizing force, remains, along with Kojève's evocation of the essence of Latin imperium, a powerful inspiration for those dedicated to the reorganization of present geopolitical realities in a more enlightened European direction.